You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When people talk about what they want sexually, they usually describe certain behaviors, positions, fantasies, roles, or activities. But those preferences only tell us part of the story. Beneath what we want to do is a deeper question. How do we want to feel during sex? Some people want to feel adored. Others want to feel powerful, desired, free, or maybe cared for. These emotional experiences are what my guests call core desires, and they argue that understanding them can offer a much richer picture of our sexuality than simply cataloging our preferred bedroom activities. Core desires may also help explain why two people can engage in the same sexual activity, but experience it in completely different ways. Core desires can shed light on our fantasies, our relationship patterns, the dynamics we repeatedly seek out, and even why certain kinds of sex might leave us feeling deeply fulfilled while others fall flat. And importantly, these desires may be shaped by our earliest developmental experiences, including the emotional needs we learn to pursue and the strategies we develop to protect ourselves. I am joined once again by Dr. Danielle Harrell and Celeste Hirschman. They are the co-creators of the Somatica Method and co-founders of the Somatica Institute, where they have trained coaches around the world in an experiential approach to sex, relationships, and personal transformation. Together, they have spent more than 20 years helping individuals and couples understand the deeper patterns that shape intimacy, communication, and desire. They are the authors of 3 books and serve as the lead sexologists and co-executive producers of the UK Channel 4 award-winning series, Virgin Island. In this episode, we're exploring where core desires come from, how they connect to attachment and developmental psychology, what they can reveal about our fantasies, and how understanding what we want to feel can help us to build more satisfying sexual relationships. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. Okay, Danielle and Celeste, let's talk about core desires. So many people think about sexual preferences simply in terms of behaviors, right? Whether they're into BDSM or role play, oral sex, or something else. But you argue that this only scratches the surface. So what exactly is a core desire, and why do you think it's a better way of understanding our sexuality?
I really love the way that you put that because that's exactly right. Like, I don't feel like we have the deeper conversation around sex, and a core desire is what you want to feel during sex. So it's all of that kind of like psychological arousal of like feeling wanted or seen or played with or toyed with or punished or, and there's just such a wide variety of ways that people want to feel. And if they don't have that conversation, there's a lot of assumptions. Maybe people think everyone wants to be romantic. Well, that's definitely not the case. Or they think everyone wants passion or everyone wants to be spiritual. We really have to have the deeper conversation to stop making those assumptions and start having sex that works for 2 or however many people are having it together,
Yeah, and just to add to this, we really see people in our offices, we really see people struggling because they feel like, there's a normal way and like everyone's supposed to be like one way or like few ways, but they don't really understand that these are just like ways to play out those longings and desires that you want to have. And that's what actually makes sex worth it. I always say, like, why drop your pants before before you get your emotional needs met? Because it's really about it's about precision. It's about like getting to this right feeling that you want to feel. And that's why it makes all the difference in the world between like mediocre and like really mind-blowing sex.
Mhm. So, as you were talking about that, I am a sexual fantasy researcher, and I was thinking about, how does this idea of core desires connect with sexual fantasies? And so I have some thoughts on this, but I'm curious. I'll ask you first. What's your take on core desire versus fantasy? Are these two sides of the same coin? Are they different concepts? What do you think about that?
So fantasies are a way to try and meet those core desires. This is like the action that people are taking in their mind, right? And then sometimes in life about trying to meet those emotional, psychological desires that they have.
I loved your book so much. We quoted it in our book. And I do feel like even when you're having sex with someone, you might be running some kind of fantasy about them, like, oh, they're really naughty. Or you have like an image of them as like,
Mhm.
you like make up that they're some sort of person out in the world, like, oh, this is a basketball star. This is so it's like, and those fantasies that you might be like layering onto your partner even, or, they like want me so much. Like those fantasies actually like give you certain kinds of feelings, like I'm special, or I'm even like way below them and I'm looking up to them, or whatever the feelings are that you might want to have. So sometimes you bring in fantasies even during sex with a partner to like deepen the intensity of the core desire that you want to feel.
Yeah. And I guess the way that I look at this and think about it is that every fantasy has at least one core desire underneath it, underlying it. And I think this is where people tend to get things wrong about sexual fantasy is, for example, when partners are sharing fantasies with one another, they'll focus on the specific act or activity that takes place in the fantasy, like maybe having a threesome or trying something kinky. And maybe one partner's into it, but the other one isn't. And then they assume that they're not compatible. And so something that I often recommend and suggest to people is that they have this conversation about how do you want to feel during sex instead of what do you fantasize about? Because if you can get at the underlying core themes, the desires that you're trying to meet, you can then use that information to kind of build this custom fantasy that turns both of you on. And maybe it doesn't look like the fantasies that typically take place in your head, but it's still very erotically arousing because it's been intentionally designed in a way that's going to tap into each partner's core desires.
Exactly. It's exactly what we do in our book Coming Together. We thought that's the process. Let's see what is it that you want to feel, and let's see how because when you talk about the feelings, it's much less threatening than if you talk about the action.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can actually, because sometimes people think, I just need this action in order to make the feeling work. I was like, wait. Let's see what's the feeling. Maybe there are like 5 other ways that you can make this feeling work. And we can help you to meet it with your partner or partners and then play together. And of course, there's also taking turns and bridging. We talk about it in our book Coming Together, like all the different ways that people can work out their fantasies together. And it always comes from, what do you actually want? You want to feel.
Yeah, I remember I was working with this couple and like he was really focused on anal sex and she was a hard no on anal. So, and had tried it, and did all the things. And then we got to the like underlying feeling that he wanted to have, which was actually really like to feel that his partner was vulnerable and that he was being let in.
Mm.
And because that's such a vulnerable part of our body, for him, that very much symbolized it. But once we got to the underlying fantasy, firstly, she softened a lot because she didn't feel like, okay, he's just trying to get this thing out of me and he doesn't care about what I want at all. And secondly, we were able to look at, are there other experiences that the two of you could have that would allow for this feeling of vulnerability and being let in? And then they were able to start to play in ways that both of them enjoyed.
Yeah, I love that example. And it has me thinking about how, in my own research, I find that having a threesome tends to be the top sexual fantasy that people report. But does that mean that all of these people actually really want to have threesomes, right? So when I start looking at, well, how do people describe their threesome fantasies? Well, first, more often than not, they're the center of attention, right? And they want to be sort of overwhelmingly desired by multiple people at once. And oftentimes, they also want to feel sexually confident or competent because they can please more than one person at the same time. And so when you start sort of stripping down what that threesome fantasy is about, oftentimes it really is just about wanting to be wanted. And sometimes that kind of goes along with having a praise kink and, wanting to be admired or appreciated for your sexual skills or prowess. And, there's all kinds of ways that you could work with your partner to get that feeling in the bedroom that don't necessitate having to bring in a third party to do that. And so I think that's really the value of kind of stripping down the fantasy and really understanding what is underlying this, when we're really trying to help couples and others try to work to improve their intimate lives together.
I know for me, threesomes were all about like teamwork. Like I wanted me and my partner to be on a team and just like take, some woman and just turn her into jello, and the two of us are like, yeah, we did it, which I do think is partly like prowess, but also this feeling of like, we're a little bit like naughty and doing it together. And so I didn't want to be the center of attention in those instances at all. In fact, it kind of would make me uncomfortable because I was like, I'm kind of a caretaker, I didn't want to, is everyone okay? It was like too many people to worry about. So it was like, okay, if you and me are doing this together, that felt very relaxing. And because people have such different needs around those things, I think it is important to have that underlying conversation.
Yeah, as I often say, two people can have the same fantasy, but for very different reasons. And I think that's also where fantasies sometimes go wrong when we try to act them out, is because, all right, let's say two partners are both into the idea of a threesome, so they bring a third person in, but maybe what they wanted out of that experience and what their core desires were drastically different. And so they don't align, and then the experience doesn't go as planned or as expected. And so that's why it's really important to go beyond just the surface layer of the behavior, the activity that you want to do, and look at, all right, what is it that you really want and how do you want to feel during sex? So can you give us some examples of core desires, right? Just so that people can kind of understand this concept a little bit more. Like, what are some specific examples of core desires people might have?
Like being seen or ravished or even like scared, worshipped. It can be like anything across the spectrum, from things that are like, I want to be like on the top of the universe to like, I want to be like put in the corner and punished. So yeah.
Yeah. And I also maybe want to introduce something into the conversation, because Les and I have been working for like over 20 years to try to understand the source of those core desires and where they're coming from. And we're like coming out with, we have a quiz that we have on our website. And what we found is, and it's built on psychological, research. And for a long time, people talk about character strategies and like the developmental wounds that we have to work through as we are growing up. And we have different kinds of places that we get like more tension in those developmental stages. So what we found, and that's something new that we kind of bringing out there, is that our core desires actually many times are coming from those core strategies that we worked out to develop and survive life. And because it had so much intensity for us, we want to keep charge. We want to keep playing it out in our sexual fantasy and in our sexual lives. And that's why we have like categories of core desires that are matching those core strategies. And it's really fun because it makes things even more precise. Like when you understand why people want what they want, there's so much more empathy, there's so much more understanding, there's so much more opportunity to not take things personally and really help people understand each other and negotiate why they're different, because most of the challenges people have is because they're different, and who is not different. So, so it really helps people have so much more opportunity for compassion, connection, empathy, and hotter sex.
And also, one of the things that once you realize it does come from those wounds and the strategies, there's so much healing possible. Sex is a very charged experience, as we're saying. And so there's a lot of, hormones in the body and arousal in the body. And if in those moments when you're most vulnerable and most alive, you also get like the tonic, like your deepest healing moments, it gets in on a level that a lot of other kinds of work don't necessarily get into. So I think that's one of the things that's like so revolutionary about honoring like where it's coming from and being like, okay, so this is like for amazing sex, this is for amazing orgasms, arousal, but also tremendous amount of healing available in sex.
Yeah. And it also explains, sorry, we look so excited about it, Justin. It also explains like how people have a lot of shame about practices. They feel like not okay? Or you're supposed to be over it? And why are you doing those weird things? So I'm just doing quotation mark because we think that it's like the most amazing healing thing to do in the bedroom. And we see that there's like what we call resolution fantasies and core desires. And there's repetition with agency, hopefully with agency, because many times people spend a lot of time in their life doing repetition of wounds without agency. So we try to give people ideas of how to have actually choice and agency around it. So when we see, for example, like if someone want to feel forced, it can be like such a great, elated experience for them to choose to have something that they had to endure growing up. Now they want to play with it in the bedroom and see how much they can take. And they feel proud to play with the pain, and it feels like so exciting and arousing. It is so healing to play with those two sides of the experience.
Stop chasing the finish line and start enjoying the journey. Summer is almost over, but there's still plenty of time to make the most of those long summer nights and maybe shake things up in the bedroom while you're at it. That's where Beducated comes in. Beducated offers more than 150 courses designed to help you discover new ways to experience pleasure, connect with a partner, and get out of the same old sexual routines. One thing I really appreciate about their approach is that better sex isn't necessarily about doing something more extreme or trying to master some complicated technique. Sometimes the most important thing we can do in the bedroom is simply slowing things down, taking the pressure off, and giving pleasure your full attention. Of course, if you do want to learn some new tricks, there's plenty to explore. You can learn how to choose and use sex toys, discover ways to banish bedroom boredom, build confidence as a lover, explore sensual massage, upgrade your oral skills, and so much more. And you don't have to figure out where to start all on your own. Beducated has a quick 5-minute quiz that creates a personalized set of recommendations based on what you want to explore. So make your last summer nights some of your best ones. Click the link in the episode description and kick off your summer of love by taking the quiz. You'll get your personalized roadmap to a slower, more pleasurable sex life with Beducated. So it sounds a little bit Freudian, a little bit psychoanalytic in terms of, where these core desires are coming from, because you're tracing them back to a lot of these very early experiences that we have in our lives.
Yeah, well, developmental. I mean, not necessarily Freudian, maybe some Erickson in there, et cetera. But sort of like, what are the deepest needs that we have in our developmental life early on? And of course, they're not perfectly met. And when they're not met, I think we start to fantasize about ways that we would want them met. And then later on, we go through puberty, we keep fantasizing, but we include masturbation in those fantasies and arousal. And then it starts to like create these circuits, Then when we play with them again and we replay them, that's where the charge comes from. So I think it makes a lot of sense looking at it from a psychological development stance. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of how this intersects with another theory, I was thinking before the show about attachment theory and how it's become so incredibly popular, especially over the last decade or so. It seems like everybody today knows what their attachment style is, and they're curious about what other people's attachment styles are. But you've argued that attachment style alone doesn't fully explain our relationship patterns or erotic lives. So what does the core desires piece add that maybe just attachment theory alone misses?
I feel like as a coach, if I know people's attachment style, if I know their trauma, and if I know their core wounds and core desires, the sky's the limit in terms of their healing potential. So we need all of them. And the one that's really been missing the most is understanding these developmental wounds, how they play out in our lives and how they play out in our sexual fantasies and desires as well. And so we really bring that as a key part of the Somatica method when we're teaching, when we're working with clients. To understand these wounds really helps to, again, as Danielle was saying, it helps couples not take things so personally, because if I know, my partner is an acceptance seeker and I'm a trust seeker, these are the kinds of clashes that we're going to have. These are the kinds of things that are going to turn us on. And it's not like, oh, why are you this way? It's like, oh, I understand why you're this way. And it has nothing to do with me. Right. And that's really relieving. And it also de-shamifies ourselves, feeling like, why do I keep having these same patterned responses over and over again? Not the ones that are around attachment, but around other things. Like if I feel like somebody's talking down to me and I'm just like, explode, It's like, where does that come from? And so that we can start being more gentle on ourselves.
Yeah, and also precision. I love precision so much. I work with couples all the time and I see them like you just tweak one sentence. I just had a session this morning and you tweaked one sentence. She's an acceptance seeker and he's a confidence seeker. And she's like, has a little bit of a critical tone because she was criticized her whole life. So she's asking him like, so are you, I just want to check if you're here. And she tried to be very gentle and I said, if you want to get more bang for your buck, just tell him, I want you here. And he just like, boof, he just want to be invited to the table. He doesn't want to be criticized. He want to be like, I want you. And he just glue up. And it was like a little bit of a tweak makes such a huge difference in the conversation and saves people so much pain and so many hours of therapy.
Yeah. So, do people's core desires stay relatively stable throughout their lives, or can they change? For example, if somebody is going through therapy and healing emotionally, or if they enter a new or different relationship or just kind of grow as a person, do their core desires change alongside that, or does it tend to be pretty stable over time?
I think core desires are pretty stable over time. Sometimes you'll do a lot of work on one wound, and then the core desires of the other one will more come to the surface. Or sometimes you'll flip between repetition with agency, where you want to repeat the same bad experience, but you want control and choice and, consent around it. Or I say bad, like challenging experience when you're in your childhood. And sometimes you want to feel more like the opposite. And so it might look like your fantasies are very different because it's like, before I like to be like spanked and punished, and now I want to be like seen and worshiped, but they can be two sides of the same coin and both are wonderful. But sometimes it changes depending on like where you are in relationship to your wound.
And also who you're playing with, because you might be playing with someone that brings some of those parts. So you feel like you can play more intensely with some of your parts because we have more than one wound. Most of us walk around with two, maybe three, like a little bit with different levels of intensity at different situations. So you get to play with those parts. And sometimes with one partner, you feel like, oh yeah, I established this. This is established. I'm the queen. Okay, now you can take me down. Like you can play with the other parts of with your wounds because you created safety or established something that feels like safety to you.
But this all has me thinking about how, as we move through life, sometimes we're developing new wounds. Like, for example, if you think about somebody who is in, say, a very long-term relationship where their sexual needs were not being met, not being prioritized, their partner was taking them for granted. When they exit that relationship, they might have kind of like a new set of needs that, maybe they didn't previously have before that relationship, but because of the way that they were consistently treated, it maybe creates some new desire that shapes kind of how they approach future relationships. So I guess my question is, do new wounds that we kind of develop along the way, can they create new core desires that we might have?
I think to some degree, but I would also say that a lot of times people get in those kinds of relationships as a repetition of the early wound because of the familiarity. So I think it's more rare that it's a whole new set of issues, unless they've sort of been like captured into a very like violent or abusive situation that they can't get out of. But often there's like attraction to a particular way of being that kind of like sits on the same system,
Mm-hmm.
and so it just exacerbates the wound maybe. And then they're like, oh, I really need to do something with this.
Yeah.
Because they did repetition without agency for a long time. So, yeah.
So how can someone figure out their core desires? Do they have to go to therapy? Right? How do you figure out what it is that you really want and need, and in terms of how you want to show up in the bedroom?
Luckily, we created a quiz. Like, seriously. No, seriously. Okay. Like, I'm really saying it because it took us years to create this quiz. Years, because we like to put really good products out there. We don't like to put stuff that just like gimmicky. And what we see is when people take the quiz, they come out with two sets of strategies. One, their core strategies in life, like who you are in the streets, and then who you are in the sheets. Some of them overlap and some of them have a little bit of differences. And then you can really get like an understanding who you are and also some ideas of how you can actually fulfill those desires, both with resolution and repetition with agency. So we like saving people. And, even if you go to therapy, take the quiz, bring it to your therapist so you can work with that. It's like an amazing entryway that saves you a whole lot of trying and figure out stuff in the dark.
Yeah, and we have classes that are particularly like help you go much more deeply into core desires to understand them even better. But I think if you start with the quiz, then you have like that inroad, and then you can take an online class as well or work with a coach. Well, the really fun thing about working with a somatica coach, once you have an idea of these wounds and desires, is that you can practice. So not just like sort of theorize and go try it out there as homework, but like, okay, let's you and me play with some of your hottest sentences right now, or let's you and me play with some of the actions or touch of those desires and see if it lands and see how do you become more precise. So those are all kinds of different ways that you can learn about and play with your core desires.
So once you've figured out your core desires, what's the best way to share that with a partner? Are there any conversations or exercises you recommend to help people kind of explore and learn about one another's core desires together?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be to create a space where you're really non-judgmental and both people have the sense like we're going to hear about each other's core desires, but we're not on the hook that we have to meet them. So if there's a space of like anything that you want is beautiful and I may or may not be able to meet it, that usually creates the foundation for a lot of honesty because it takes a lot of pressure out of the system, because that way it's like, okay, so if your core desires aren't really a turn on to me, I don't have to engage in them, but I also don't have to shame them because that's what you really want to avoid is like shaming your partner's core desires. There's like almost nothing that you can tell a person that's more vulnerable and tender than a core desire. So you want to create a really safe space for that communication. And then you want to start with, so what do you want to feel during sex?
And we have a class, as Celeste said earlier, on learn.somatica.com that really like walks you step by step, especially in addition to the quiz where you figured out who you are and what you want to feel. Also, we demonstrate how to have those conversations. We demonstrate how to have challenging conversation when it's not really easy to bring up your feelings and what you want to explore with them. So it's just like a short class that you can take and really kind of have examples of how to do that.
So let's say you share your core desires with your partner, but they're pretty discrepant, right? So let's say they don't necessarily on the surface look like they line up with one another. So what do you do when people just have very different underlying emotional needs that are just quite different from one another?
Well, we have 5 options for that.
I think the first one, even before we look at the other 5, is we really try to be creative, like you were saying, Justin. And one of the most creative people I've ever met around this is Danielle. So she's an inspiration to like, how can you really trickily get like very disparate core desires to both happen in a sexual experience? So I do say like, don't give up hope right away, because sometimes there's ways to do it that you would never even have thought of. And sometimes you do need a coach to help you a bit with that. And then, if it doesn't turn out to be that way, you really have to sort of decide like, are we going to outsource here? Are we going to sort of deal with that disappointment of not having it? We really encourage people not to just sit there and build resentment. I think that's the least favorite choice.
People do that though. So that's one of the options. People sit for years. But really helping people have empathy and understand that it's not personal, and that helps people make decisions that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to split up, but maybe they have other ways to meet those needs. And the sky's the limit of how many options there are to try and meet those needs. And sometimes people like okay with taking turns, but sometimes they're not. And then, the honest outsourcing and yeah.
I give similar advice when people ask me, well, I shared my fantasy with a partner and they're not into it. Well, what do I do? And, the first step is, well, first thank them for sharing that fantasy with you, right? Because that vulnerability is often the hardest part. And, avoiding the shame and judgment, because that's where these conversations just go totally off the rails. And if you judge or shame your partner for sharing their desires, odds are they're probably never going to share anything very vulnerable with you again. So that first part is just recognizing it. And then I think it's often taking some time to sit with it and think about it. Oftentimes if a partner is sharing a fantasy or desire with us that we ourselves have never personally experienced, we might not be turned on by it. simply because we've just never thought about it before. And sometimes just kind of like sitting with it for a while and learning more about it, exploring it a little bit might change your mind. Oftentimes I like to say about sex, we don't know what we like until we actually try it. And so sometimes being willing to explore and experiment a little bit can also help in terms of bridging that divide sometimes. But yeah, in some cases, people just won't be on the same page and they have to decide what to do. And there are people I've seen who stick it out in long-term relationships with that high level of resentment. And I don't think that's a healthy situation for anybody. But other times people open their relationship. Sometimes they break up and move on, or other times they just find ways to bridge the divide and bring in a therapist. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of ways it can go here.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, like before sharing the fantasy, share the feelings. It softens the presentations. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Celeste and Danielle. It was really a pleasure to have both of you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and also to take your quiz on core desires?
Definitely. So the quiz is on somatica.com/quiz. And that's also, you'll get to our website and you can learn more about us. If you want to be a coach and you want to learn more about that, go to somaticainstitute.com.
Well, I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having both of you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.